The night they laughed at Nora Beale. The Montana sky was the color of iron, and the church hall smelled of wood smoke and cider, and the particular warmth of too many people in a room that was not built for all of them at once. It was the harvest supper. It was November of 1883. Every family in Briggs Creek was there. Josephine Whitmore stood at the head of the long table, with her glass raised and her smile arranged and her voice carrying easily to every corner of the hall. Because Josephine had a voice that knew how to carry. She was speaking about her sister. She was always speaking about her sister at moments like this. And she did it beautifully. With the practiced grief of a woman who understood that grief, performed correctly, was a form of authority. She said Clara's name the way she always said it. Soft, deliberate. A hand pressed briefly to the collarbone. She talked about the double W the way Clara had kept it, the way the windows had always been clean, the way the table had always been set properly, the way certain standards had been maintained in that house through all the years of Clara's life there, and how much it meant to the whole family that those standards endured. And then she said it. She said she was grateful, of course, for all the help that had come to the double W in the difficult years since. All manner of help. She paused. She let her eyes travel, just briefly, to the far end of the table, where Nora Beale sat with her hands folded in her lap. Why, she said, their cook had certainly made herself quite at home at the double W table. Every inch of her. The laughter came the way laughter does when a room has been waiting for permission. It rolled from the head of the table backward through the hall in a wave. And it was not the laughter of people who meant serious harm. It was the laughter of people who had been given something easy and had taken it. Which was, Nora had long understood, perhaps the most honest thing human beings ever did. She did not look down. She was aware of her hands in her lap. She was aware of the heat in her face and the sound of the laughter and the way the woman across the table from her had turned her head very deliberately toward the window, so as not to have to choose between laughing and not laughing. She was aware of May Gruder, 3 seats down, who had gone very still in the particular way of a person deciding what to do with their hands. And she was aware of Tommy. Tommy Whitmore was 7 years old, and he was sitting in the third pew along the side wall where the children had been seated after supper. And he was holding his mother's prayer book with both hands. And his face had done something that Nora had never seen it do before. It had collapsed. Not into tears, into something quieter and more serious than tears. The face of a child who has just understood something about the world that he did not want to understand. She looked at him. He looked at her. She did not look down. That was the night. That was the moment. But to understand what it meant, you have to go back further. You have to go back to a river crossing in April of 1881, and a horse that made it, and a man who did not. If this story is already pulling at you, do me a favor before we go any further. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss a story from this channel, and drop your city in the comments right now. I love knowing where you all are listening from. People watch these from their kitchens, from their porches, from their beds at 10 o'clock at night. And I think about every one of you. Stay with me until the end of this one. I promise you, what Cal Whitmore finds in that little prayer book is going to stay with you for a long time. Now, let's go back to where it all began. Roy Beale was not a bad man. This is important to say first, because the easiest thing, and the least honest thing, would be to make him a villain in retrospect, to find reasons why his death was uncomplicated for the woman who watched it happen. It was not uncomplicated. Roy Beale was not a bad man. He was a man of reasonable intentions and unreasonable optimism, which in the Montana Territory in 1881 was a combination that the land did not always forgive. He had come west from Ohio with a land claim and a plan, and a wife he loved in the imprecise, well-meaning way of a man who has never been required to be precise about anything. Nora had understood this about him from early in their marriage and had decided it was enough. She was practical. She had married a man whose intentions were good and whose ambitions were large, and she had understood that the space between those two things would be hers to fill. And she had filled it. For 6 years, with her cooking and her organizing, and her quiet management of everything, Roy was too optimistic to manage himself. She did not resent him for this. She had chosen it with open eyes. What she had not chosen, and could not have chosen, was the Musselshell River in April. The crossing was Roy's idea. The ferry was 2 days downstream, and he had decided, in the particular way he decided things, that the water was low enough and the horse was strong enough, and that they had lost enough time already. Nora had looked at the river. She had looked at it for a long time. She was not a woman who frightened easily. But the Musselshell in April snowmelt was not the same river it was in August. And she had told him so. Roy had agreed with her completely and begun the crossing anyway. The horse made it. The current took Roy 12 feet from the far bank, in water that looked, from where Nora stood, entirely manageable. And it did not let him go. She ran downstream along the bank for a quarter mile. She did not find him. She found him 3 days later, 2 miles further on, which is the detail she never told anyone, and which she carried in her chest like a stone for the 2 years that followed. She was 29 years old. She had $40 in the wagon box, a cast-iron skillet her mother had given her when she married, and 2 mules that were hers by right, and that she sold in Billings for 60 more. She had no family within 800 miles. She had no land claim of her own, because the claim had been Roy's, and without Roy it reverted to the territory, because that was the law, and the law, as Nora had come to understand, was written by men who had not spent much time imagining the specific situation of a woman standing alone on the bank of a river in April. She did not cry about this. She had cried at the river. She was finished crying. She hired herself out in Billings as a cook. She was good at it, which she had always known, and she was organized, which the establishments that hired her had not always expected from a woman who looked the way she looked, which was to say, large and plain and unhurried, with the kind of face that people looked at once, and then looked past without noticing what was in it. This had been true of Nora her entire life. People looked at the surface of her and concluded they had seen the whole. She had decided, somewhere in her 20s, that this was their limitation and not hers. She had a life going on inside her that had nothing to do with what they saw, and she had long since ceased trying to show it to people who had already decided not to look. She wrote in the margins of things. This had started when she was a girl in Illinois, when her schoolteacher had caught her writing in the margins of her speller and, instead of punishing her, had asked what she was writing. Nora had shown her, embarrassed. She had been writing small observations about the words, where they came from, what they actually meant as opposed to how people used them. The teacher had looked at it for a long time and then handed the speller back without comment. And the next morning, there had been a dictionary on Nora's desk with a note tucked inside that said only, "Keep going." She had kept going. She wrote in the margins of her flower receipts in Billings. She wrote in the margins of the almanac she kept above the kitchen stove. Small things. A word she had encountered and looked up. A sentence that had struck her. An observation about the quality of light on the Yellowstone River at a particular hour. She did not think of this as writing. She thought of it as keeping track, which was what she had always done with the things around her that she did not want to lose. In the summer of 1883, a letter came through the agency in Billings from a rancher in Briggs Creek by the name of Magruder, who was not the rancher, but who had been authorized by the rancher to hire a cook, the previous cook having departed for California in the spring. The letter was plain and accurate. It described the work, the pay, the sleeping arrangements, and the household. 2 boys, it said. No woman of the house, foreman, 6 hands, and a man named Whitmore who ran the operation and kept to himself. Nora read the letter twice and wrote back that she would come. She did not ask what Whitmore looked like. She did not ask his age. She asked whether there was a kitchen garden and whether she would have full authority over the pantry. And the reply that came back said yes on both counts. In a handwriting that was different from the first letter, more compressed, and that she later understood was Cal Whitmore's own. She arrived at the Double W on a Tuesday in late August, on the back of the supply wagon from town. With her cast-iron skillet wrapped in her good apron in the bottom of her bag, the ranch was larger than she had expected. The house was solid and square, 2 stories of timber and stone, with a covered porch along the front and a kitchen addition built off the back that was, she noted immediately, a serious kitchen, a real stove, A work table long enough to actually work at. Shelves. A window over the sink that looked east. Which meant morning light. Which was what she had always wanted. May Gruder met her at the kitchen door. May was 64 years old and had the posture of a woman who had carried heavy things for most of her life and had made her peace with it. She looked at Nora the way Nora had learned to expect women of a certain practical generation to look at her. Which was to say directly, without performing any reaction to her sighs one way or the other, and said, "You're Nora Beale." "I am," Nora said. "Good," said May, and stood aside to let her in. Nora set her bag down inside the kitchen door, and looked around at the stove and the shelves, and the window, and the long work table, and she felt something that she was careful not to name too quickly, which was the particular feeling of a space that fit the shape of the work she knew how to do. "I'll show you your room," May said, "in a minute." Nora said, and went to check the stove. That was how she came to the Double W, not with introduction or ceremony or any particular welcome. She came in through the kitchen door and checked the stove and began. She did not meet Cal Whitmore that day. She heard him come in at dusk. Heard his boots on the porch boards and the brief exchange of words with the foreman at the door. Heard him go up the stairs, without coming to the kitchen. She had supper ready. May took a plate up to the boys and brought a plate to the table, and reported that Mr. Whitmore had eaten in the dining room, which was apparently his custom. She met Josephine Whitmore at supper the following evening. Josephine had been at the ranch for 6 weeks by then. She had arrived in July from Helena with 2 trunks and a story about wanting to be near the boys in the difficult years. And she had settled herself into the second bedroom upstairs, with a thoroughness that suggested she had not thought seriously about leaving. She was Clara Whitmore's younger sister, which gave her a position in the household that no one had explicitly defined, and that she had therefore defined herself, quietly and comprehensively, over the course of those 6 weeks. She came into the kitchen the evening of Nora's second day, at a time when Nora was making biscuits, which required both hands and most of her attention, and she stood in the doorway for a moment before she spoke. "You must be the new cook," she said. "Nora Beale," Nora said, and did not stop working the dough. Josephine looked at her with the particular expression of a woman taking inventory. And Nora felt the inventory being taken and understood its conclusions, without needing to see them confirmed. "Well," Josephine said. She moved to the shelf and examined a jar of preserves with the air of a person checking for dust. "May tells me you've cooked in Billings." 2 years. Nora said, "The boys are particular about their food." Josephine said, "Tommy especially, he's sensitive. He was very close to his mother." A pause. "We all were." "I expect so," Nora said. "The arrangement," Josephine said, setting the jar back with a small, deliberate click, "is that you cook and clean the kitchen, take your meals in here or with May, and bring questions about the household to me rather than bothering Mr. Whitmore directly. He has enough to manage." Nora looked up from the dough, then she looked at Josephine for a moment, the way she looked at things she was deciding about. "All right," she said, and went back to the biscuits. That was the arrangement. She met Tommy the next morning. She was at the stove at 5 o'clock, which was when she was always at the stove. And the house was entirely quiet, and she was working the way she liked to work in the early morning, which was without speaking and without being spoken to, in the particular piece of a kitchen that belongs to the person in it. She had bread rising. She had coffee on. She was slicing salt pork into the skillet when she heard the small sound behind her. She turned. Tommy Whitmore was standing in the kitchen doorway in his nightshirt and bare feet, with his dark hair pressed flat on one side from sleep and his eyes, at that particular unguarded state of very early morning before the day's arrangements had gone back on. He was holding a small leather book against his chest with both arms, the way a child holds something they sleep with. He looked at her, she looked at him. She had cooked in households with children before. She understood that children often came to kitchens in the early morning, pulled by the smell of bread or the light or the particular gravity of a warm room in a cold house. She understood that the correct response was neither to make a performance of welcoming them, nor to send them back to bed, but simply to proceed, which made the kitchen safe and the child comfortable without requiring anything of either party. "You hungry?" she said. He shook his head. She turned back to the skillet. She heard him come into the room, heard the scrape of the stool as he climbed onto it at the end of the work table. For a while there was no sound but the skillet and the bread and the morning. Then he said, "What does that word mean?" She looked over. He had opened the little leather book on the work table and was pointing at a line on the page. His small finger pressed below a word she could not see from where she stood. She crossed to him and looked. The book was a prayer book, old and well used, the spine cracked and the cover worn soft with handling. The page he had opened was a psalm, and the word his finger rested under was the word supplication. "It means asking," she said, "asking for something you need very much." He looked at the word for a moment, then at her. "Like if you're really hungry," he said. "Something like that," she said. She went back to the stove. Then she stopped. She reached into her apron pocket where she always kept a pencil, and she came back to the book, and looked at the word again, and wrote in the margin, very small, "Asking for something you truly need," from the Latin supplicare, to kneel and ask. She drew a small pair of hands, folded, the kind of simple drawing she had always put beside her definitions. A habit from her Illinois schoolgirl days. She capped the pencil and put it back in her pocket and returned to the stove. Tommy looked at the margin note for a long time. "You wrote in it," he said. There was no accusation in his voice, only observation. "I'll cross it out if you'd rather," she said. He looked at it again. Then he shook his head. "It's all right," he said. "I couldn't read that word anyway." She turned the salt pork. She did not say anything else. Neither did he. He sat on his stool at the end of the work table with the prayer book open in front of him until the bread came out of the oven. At which point she gave him the heel of it with butter without being asked. Because she had been a child once and she understood about the heel of the bread. He ate it with both hands and then slid off the stool and went back upstairs. And she heard his bare feet on the steps. And she stood at the stove with the skillet in her hand and the kitchen quiet around her. And she thought that was where it began. Not with the cooking, with a pencil, and a word a 7-year-old could not yet read. She was at the stove at 5 o'clock the next morning when she heard the boots. These were not a child's feet. These were the boots of a grown man on the back porch stairs, deliberate and unhurried, and she had time to register this before the kitchen door opened and Cal Whitmore came in. She had seen him at a distance. Crossing the yard or riding out at dawn, the tall, straight figure of a man who moved as if he had decided where he was going and saw no reason to reconsider. Up close he was older than she had estimated, or perhaps not older but more worn, with the particular weathering of a face that had spent years in Montana wind and sun without being vain about it. He had dark hair going silver at the temples, and eyes that were a color she found difficult to name later. When she tried, not gray, not quite brown, a color that seemed to take its quality from whatever light it was in. He stopped inside the door and looked at her. She looked back at him. "Miss Beale," he said. "Mr. Whitmore," she said. He crossed to the stove, took the coffee pot, poured himself a cup with the ease of a man who had been doing this in this kitchen for years, and sat down at the far end of the work table. He put both hands around the cup. He looked at the window, which at that hour showed nothing but black glass and their own faint reflections. He did not say anything else. She went back to her bread. She shaped the loaves. She slid them into the oven. She sliced the bacon and laid it in the skillet. She made no conversation and did not feel the lack of it. After a while, he said. "May says you came from Billings, 2 years, she said. He nodded as if this confirmed something. He drank his coffee. He looked at the window. "You've cooked before that," he said. "All my life," she said. "My own household for 6 years before Billings." He nodded again. There was another silence. The kind that was not uncomfortable. The skillet spoke. The stove spoke. The dark outside the window began, very slowly, to soften toward gray. "The bread smells right," he said. She said nothing, because there was nothing to add to that. He finished his coffee, stood, rinsed the cup at the pump, and set it on the shelf. He put on his hat. He went out the kitchen door without another word. and she heard his boots on the porch steps and then the yard. Going toward the barn, she stood at the stove and turned the bacon, and did not examine what she was feeling. Because she was a practical woman and the bacon required attention. That evening, at supper, Josephine served herself from the bread basket first, as she always did, and then held it across the table to Nora, with a smile that was all surface. "Do have some more bread, Nora," she said. "You must work up such an appetite. Cooking all day." Ellis, 12 years old, was looking at his plate. Tommy was looking at his bread. May, at the far end of the table, had gone very still. Nora took a piece of bread from the basket. She set it on her plate. She looked at Josephine with the particular expression she had developed over 34 years for moments exactly like this one, which was no expression at all. "Thank you," she said. Josephine smiled. She passed the basket on. Cal Whitmore, at the head of the table, said nothing. His face gave nothing. He ate his supper and looked at his plate and was whatever he was behind that weathered, contained face of his, and Nora did not know yet what that was. She did not know yet if it mattered. She did not look down. That was the arrangement. And for now, that was all it was. September came in cool and fast the way Montana Septembers did, as if the land had decided summer was a formality it had already extended too long. The mornings dropped to frost by the third week. And the kitchen at 5 o'clock became the warmest room in the house, which meant that it became, without any discussion, the room people came to. Tommy came every morning. This was established by the end of the first week as simply a fact of the household. The way the roosters and the sunrise were facts, unargued and unremarkable. He came in his nightshirt at first. Then, as the mornings grew colder, in his clothes, dressed in the dark before the rest of the house stirred, appearing at the kitchen doorway, with the prayer book under his arm, and his hair uncombed, and his face wearing that early morning openness that he lost. Like all children lost it. Within an hour of fully waking, he did not always ask about words. Sometimes he simply sat. Sometimes he watched her work with the focused, companionable attention of a child who is comfortable in a space, which is the highest compliment a child can pay to a place or a person, and which they pay without knowing they are paying it. But there was usually a word. There was always a word she did not know he'd been saving. Something from the psalm or the prayer he'd been turning over since the morning before, held in his mouth like a stone, brought out when he was ready. Benediction. She wrote a blessing spoken aloud, so the person receiving it can hear it. From the Latin, bene, well, and dicere, to speak, to say something good about someone. Out loud. So it counts. Covenant. She wrote a promise so serious that both people who made it understood they could not unmake it. Different from a regular promise. A covenant means, I knew what I was agreeing to, and I agreed anyway. Steadfast. She wrote not moving, even when moving would be easier. The kind of person who stays. She drew beside this one a small tree in wind. Bent but rooted. Tommy studied it for a long time, tracing the roots with one finger without touching the page. Hovering just above it, the way children touch things that matter to them. Like Papa, he said. She did not say anything. She turned back to the stove. He doesn't move, Tommy said. Even when things are hard, he just stays there and doesn't move. That's a good thing to be, she said. Mama was like that too, he said. It was the first time he had mentioned his mother directly to Nora. He said it simply, without performance. The way children say the true things, which is flatly and clearly, and without any of the decorative grief that adults layer over the same truths to make them easier to carry. She stayed. Even when she was sick, she stayed. May says she held on past when most people would have. Nora turned the bread on the rack. She said, she sounds like she was a steadfast woman. Tommy considered this. Then he opened the book and looked at the word again, and at the small drawn tree in the wind. And Nora understood without looking that he was mapping something, connecting one thing to another with the natural precision of a child's mind, which makes these connections constantly and easily, and with a certainty that adults spend their whole lives trying to recover. Cal came every morning too. This also established itself without discussion, as if the early kitchen had a gravity of its own that pulled the people in that house toward it before the day's arrangements went on. and required them to be the people they were publicly. He came in his boots, with the mud of the yard already on them, because he had always checked the barn first. And he poured his own coffee, and he sat at the far end of the work table, and they worked and sat in the same room, in the particular way of two people who have silently agreed that silence between them is not a problem to be solved. The conversations grew. Not quickly, not artificially, they grew the way things grow in cold climates. Slowly and close to the ground, without announcing themselves. He told her about the wheat. He was running a mixed operation, cattle and grain, which some of the ranchers in the county thought was unnecessary diversification and which Cal thought was simple sense. He had put in 40 acres of turkey red the previous autumn, a hard winter variety that a Mennonite family had brought from Russia, and the results had been better than the county average through the dry summer. She asked him questions, real questions, the kind that required him to think before answering, about the soil and the water table and the rotation he was using. He looked at her the first time she asked a real question, with an expression she recognized, because she had seen it before, on the faces of men who had been expecting a polite noise of attention and had received instead an actual inquiry. He answered her. He talked about the wheat for 20 minutes one morning in October while she made pie crust, and he sat with his second cup of coffee. And when he was done talking, she said, "Have you thought about putting in a kitchen garden on the south side of the house? The drainage there looks right, and you'd have a windbreak from the house wall in March." He looked at the window in the direction of the south side of the house. "No," he said. "I hadn't." "Think about it," she said. He thought about it. By the end of October he had turned the soil on the south side of the house in preparation for spring planting, without mentioning this to her directly, which she understood was simply his way. Ellis watched all of this. He was 12 years old, and he had, since his mother's death, taken on the particular vigilance of a child who has decided that loving people is a risk that requires management. He watched Nora with his mother's dark eyes, which were also his father's eyes, and he watched her the way he watched everything, with a thoroughness that an adult in his position might have called suspicion, but which was, Nora understood, something more careful than that. It was assessment. He was deciding whether she was what she appeared to be, or whether she was something else, wearing the appearance of what she appeared to be. He did not speak to her unless spoken to. He ate her food without commenting on it, and cleared his plate entirely at every meal, which was its own kind of commentary that he was either unaware of or had chosen not to suppress. He sometimes stood in the kitchen doorway in the mornings when Tommy was at the work table, and he watched. And then he went away. She did not try to win him. She understood that trying to win Ellis would be the wrong approach, because Ellis was not a boy who could be won. He could only be known, slowly and honestly, without any pretense that she was not watching him too. May Gruder had been at the W for 9 years. She had come in the second year of Cal and Clara's marriage, hired as housekeeper, and she had watched the household through the building years, and the good years, and the year Clara got sick, and the winter she died, and the 4 years after, which May described to no one, under ordinary circumstances, in any detail. She described them to Nora on a Thursday evening in October, when the men were at the far barn, dealing with a heifer that had gotten into wire, and Tommy and Ellis were in bed. And the kitchen was quiet and lamplight warm, and it was the kind of evening that invites honesty the way certain rooms invite it, by being contained and warm and removed from the requirements of the day. May was shelling beans at one end of the work table. Nora was putting up the last of the apple preserves at the other end. The stove ticked. The lamp held its circle of gold over the table between them. "You want to know about him," May said. It was not a question. Nora did not look up from the jar she was sealing. "I want to know what I need to know to work here well," she said. May considered this distinction for a moment and appeared to find it acceptable. "Clara was sick for 8 months, she said. She knew what it was by March, and she didn't tell Cal until June, because she wanted him to get the spring planting in without carrying it. That was Clara. She arranged things. She thought about what needed doing, and she arranged it. Before she told anyone there was a problem, Nora said nothing. She turned the jar and set it on the rack. He sat with her every night the last 2 months. May said he'd work all day and come in and eat standing up in the kitchen, and then go up and sit with her until she slept. And then he'd come back down and sit on the porch until he was tired enough to go to bed himself.
This was November. You know what November is like here. He sat on that porch anyway.
The beans fell into the pot with a small, steady sound. After, May said, he didn't sit on the porch anymore. He'd come in, eat, see the boys to bed, go to his room. That was all.
The hands said he worked from before light to after dark. And that was what saved the ranch that next year. Because he was not fit to stop working. And the work needed doing. And those two things held each other up.
Nora reached for another jar. He hasn't laughed since November of 1881. May said, I've counted, it's been 2 years.
He smiles sometimes. At the boys. At the dog when she does something foolish. But a laugh is a different thing. A laugh means you forgot. For a second.
That you're carrying what you're carrying. He hasn't forgotten. Not once. She was quiet for a moment. The beans.
Tommy has his way with the mornings now, she said.
Not quite a question. He comes at 5, Nora said.
He didn't come to the kitchen in the mornings before you.
May said. He didn't want to be in here. It was where Clara cooked. Nora stopped. She set the jar down and looked at the table, and thought about Tommy climbing onto his stool in the dark of 5 o'clock on that first morning.
And the prayer book. And the word he had brought her. And what it meant that he had brought it here. To this kitchen. To this room he had avoided for nearly 2 years.
She did not say anything. She picked up the jar and went back to work. Ellis was with her at the end, May said. Cal was riding for the doctor. It came faster than any of them expected, and Ellis was the one in the room. He was 10 years old. She paused. He hasn't told Cal that.
I don't think Cal knows.
The kitchen held this information for a moment. He knows you're decent. May said then, and her tone had changed, become more matter-of-fact. As if she had said the necessary things and was now simply concluding, Cal, he doesn't say things like that directly. But I can tell you he knows it. He watches, same as Ellis, but for different reasons. What reasons? Nora said.
May looked at her over the bean pot with the expression of a woman who has decided to be straightforward.
Because he is a man who has been alone for 2 years, in a house with his grief and his boys, and no one to talk to at 5 in the morning, she said.
And now he has someone.
Nora did not answer this. She sealed the last jar and set it on the rack and looked at the row of them, amber and gold, in the lamplight. Josephine doesn't like it, May said.
No,
Nora agreed. She came because she thought. May stopped, started again. She came for reasons that are not my business to say directly.
But I'll tell you, they are not entirely about the boys. Nora thought about the arrangement.
She thought about the thin click of the preserve jar and the measuring inventory and the smile at the supper table. She thought about what it would mean to a woman like Josephine to come to a house expecting a particular future and find a fat plain widow cook already occupying the kitchen at 5 in the morning. I understand, she said. She understood very well. It was a Tuesday in late October, when Josephine made the comment to Helen Marsh.
Helen Marsh was the wife of the county land agent and came twice a week to the W to work with Josephine on the church social committee, which was organizing the harvest supper.
They worked at the dining room table, with the door open. Because the house was warm, Nora was in the kitchen. The window over the sink was open 2 inches for the steam. She was not trying to hear. She heard. Josephine's voice carried, as it always did, with the ease of a woman who had never been required to moderate it. She was saying something about the household, about the difficulty of maintaining proper standards when you were not, ultimately, mistress of the house. About the good intentions of the help and the limits of those intentions.
And then, in a tone of performative, sighing concern, she said, "You know how these big women are in a kitchen. Everything goes into the pot, or into themselves."
Helen Marsh made a sound that was halfway between a laugh and a social noise. Nora set down the pot she was holding. She stood at the stove and looked at the kitchen wall, and was aware of her hands, which were steady, and her chest, which was doing something she recognized as anger, of the cold, clean kind, the kind that did not require expression to be real.
She heard the back door.
Cal came in from the yard. Having come around the back of the house from the direction of the barn, he stopped inside the kitchen door. He looked at Nora, who was standing at the stove not cooking anything, which was an unusual thing for Nora to do. He looked at the open window. He listened for a moment. The dining room door was open and Josephine's voice was audible, though what she was saying now was something else, something about the church social. His face did not change. He hung his hat on the peg. He went to the dining room door. Nora heard him say, in the voice he used when he was being precise, "Josephine." A word. She could not hear what followed. She could hear the register of his voice, which was low and very even. And she could hear that it went on for perhaps 45 seconds without interruption. She could hear Josephine begin something once and stop. Then there was silence. And then Cal came back into the kitchen and took his hat off the peg and went back out the way he'd come. He did not look at Nora on his way past. He did not explain. He said nothing at all. She heard Josephine's voice resume in the dining room a moment later, talking about linen, pleasant and continuous. As if nothing had been interrupted, Josephine did not make that kind of comment in Cal's presence again. Nora stood at the stove and turned the heat down under the pot and understood that something had happened that she was not going to be told about directly and that she did not need to be told about directly to understand. She understood it the way she understood most things about the double W now. Sideways and in full. She did not know what to do with it. So she did what she always did with things she did not know what to do with, yet. She put it somewhere she could think about it later. And she went back to work. It was in November, 3 weeks before the harvest supper, that Ellis came to the barn. It was midnight. Nora had gone out at 9 o'clock when the foreman had knocked on the bunkhouse door to say one of the calves was coming wrong and the hands weren't sure it was going to make it. She wasn't a ranching woman, and she had no special expertise in the matter. But she had been present at enough difficult births of various kinds in her 34 years to be useful, and useful was what she went to be. The calf came right in the end. After 2 hours and a great deal of effort from the cow and a good deal of calm talking from Nora, who had discovered over the years that large animals in difficulty responded to a steady voice the same way people did, which was, with more cooperation than they managed otherwise. By midnight the calf was up on its legs, and the cow was recovered enough to take over. And the hands had gone back to the bunkhouse. And Nora was sitting on the floor of the stall, with her back against the boards, her dress ruined, her arms aching, watching the calf figure out the logistics of its new legs with the philosophical approach of an animal that has no opinion about embarrassment. She heard the barn door. Ellis came down the row of stalls. He was in his coat and boots, which meant he had dressed to come out here deliberately, not stumbled out half asleep. He stopped outside the stall and looked at the calf. And then at Nora sitting on the floor in her ruined dress. And he said nothing, she said nothing. He reached over the stall gate and unlatched it, and came in, and sat down on the floor against the boards beside her, which was, given the condition of the floor, a significant gesture from a 12-year-old who cared about his clothes. They watched the calf. After a while Ellis said, "Is it going to be all right?" "It's going to be fine," she said. "Look at it, already thinking it owns the place." The calf was pushing its face against the cow's side with a persistence that was half hunger and half bravado. Ellis almost smiled. He caught it and didn't. But she saw it. The small beginning of a smile at the corner of his mouth. And she filed it away without remarking on it, because remarking on it would have made him self-conscious. And that was not something she was going to do to this boy. They sat in the barn for another hour. Nora did not make conversation, and Ellis did not make conversation, and the cow and the calf managed their business, and the barn around them was warm and smelled of hay and animal, and the particular intimacy of a closed space in a cold night. At 1 o'clock Ellis said, "I was the one with her when she died." Nora looked at the calf. "I know," she said. He looked at her. "How?" "May told me." He was quiet. Then, "Does Papa know you know?" "I don't think so." He processed this. He looked at the calf and then at his boots, and then at the middle distance that children look at when they are managing something large in a small body. "It wasn't bad," he said. "At the end, It wasn't what I thought it would be, she wasn't. He stopped, she just stopped. She was talking, and then she stopped, and it was very quiet, and I thought she was sleeping. Nora did not say she was sorry. She had learned over the years that saying you were sorry to people in this kind of pain was a response to your own discomfort and not to theirs. And that what people in this kind of pain needed was not to be apologized to but to be heard.
You were there, she said.
You stayed. He looked at her. You were 10 years old, and you stayed, she said. That was the right thing.
That was the steadfast thing. He looked away. He pressed his lips together in the way of someone deciding about tears, which was a decision she respected and did not interfere with.
After a moment he said, she would have liked you. Nora was quiet. She liked plain-talking people, he said. She didn't like. He searched for the word.
She didn't like performance.
She said performing was what you did when you didn't trust the truth to be enough. Nora thought about Clara sitting with that knowledge in March and organizing the spring planting before she said a word to anyone.
She thought about Clara steadfast.
Clara staying. Clara trusting the truth to be enough for 8 months, in which she could have asked for sympathy and didn't. She sounds like she was a remarkable woman. Nora said. She was. Ellis said, simply and completely and with the flat, honest certainty of a child, which is more authoritative than any other kind. They sat until the calf had nursed and settled, and then they walked back to the house, in the November dark. The cold, enormous around them, and the sky overhead layered with stars, and the grass on either side of the path silver with frost. Ellis walked beside her. Not in front. Not behind. Beside. At the back door he stopped and said, "Good night, Miss Beale." "Good night, Ellis," she said. He went in. She stood on the porch for a moment in the cold, and looked at the sky, and felt something she recognized as quiet, the specific quiet of a night that has given you more than you expected to receive, and she stood in it for a moment before she went in.
She was in bed by 2 o'clock, at 8:15 in the morning. After Cal had gone out, and the boys had left for school, May came to the kitchen with a piece of paper folded twice, and she set it on the work table while Nora was cleaning the stove.
"I found it in the kitchen waste last night," May said, after Josephine went up. Nora looked at the paper.
She wiped her hands on her apron and picked it up and unfolded it. It was a letter, a draft of a letter, written in Josephine's careful, upright hand on the double W's writing paper, addressed to a Mr. Gerald Foss, of the Helena Law Office of Foss and Britton. Nora read it slowly, and with the attention she gave to things that mattered. It was 3 paragraphs. The first established Josephine as the late Mrs. Whitmore's sister, present at the ranch, in an oversight capacity for the welfare of the 2 Whitmore boys. The second described, with elegant imprecision, certain concerns about the domestic arrangements at the ranch, the unsupervised access of the hired cook to the children, the particular concern of a young boy who had become, in her view, overly attached to a woman of limited background and no family connection to the household. The third paragraph asked Mr.
Foss whether it might be possible to arrange for a formal review of the boys' welfare under Montana territorial law, and whether such a review might recommend changes in the household's current arrangement.
Nora read it twice.
She folded it. She put it in her apron pocket. She stood at the kitchen work table in the particular stillness that comes to a person when they understand clearly, for the first time, the exact dimensions of what they are facing. It was not cooking she could do to fix this. It was not bread or kindness or early mornings at the stove. It was not Tommy's word by word, or Ellis in the barn at midnight. It was not even Cal's quiet 45 seconds behind the dining room door. This was of a different order. This was a woman who intended to use the law the way she used everything else, as a performance of virtue in the service of removal. May stood across the work table, watching her. Nora looked up from the pocket where the letter was. She looked at May, and May looked back at her, steady and waiting.
She did not look down. She did not tell Cal about the letter. She thought about it for 3 days.
Turned it the way you turn a stone in your hand to understand its weight and its edges. And at the end of 3 days, she knew she was not going to tell him.
Not because she doubted him.
She had stopped doubting Cal Whitmore sometime in October. In the particular way you stop doubting a thing when you have watched it be consistently itself in enough different kinds of weather.
She knew what he was. She knew what his word was worth.
She did not tell him because telling him would require him to act. And his acting would become a confrontation with Josephine that would require Josephine to defend herself. And Josephine defending herself in that house would cost the boys something they had already paid too much for. A woman who had decided to use the law as a weapon did not stop deciding that because she had been confronted. She simply became more careful about where she left her drafts. Nora was practical. She had always been practical. She kept the letter in her apron pocket for 1 day. Then moved it to the lining of her bag. She thought about writing to Gerald Foss herself. Then thought better of it.
She thought about May, who had brought her the letter, and was now watching her in the particular way of a person who has handed someone a problem and is waiting to see what they do with it. What she did was cook.
She baked bread and put up the last of the winter stores, and planned the menus for the week of the harvest supper, and sharpened all the knives
which needed doing. And she wrote in the margins of Tommy's book every morning, and answered his words, and watched him sound out the one she had defined, and felt the specific weight
of a situation that was going to resolve itself one way or another, and that she could not fully control. Tommy brought her the word merciful on a Thursday morning. She wrote, willing, to be gentle, when you had the power to be hard. From the Latin, misericordia, a heart that feels the sorrow of others, the rarest kind of strength. He traced the letters without touching the page. He said, "Are you merciful, Miss Beale?" She thought about the letter in the lining of her bag. "I try to be," she said.
He nodded,
as if this was what he had expected, and climbed off his stool and went upstairs to get ready for school. And she stood at the stove and put both hands flat on the warm iron surface and breathed. The harvest supper was on the 15th of November. The church hall was decorated with dried corn and bunting, and the particular festive effort of a small town that takes its celebrations seriously, because it does not have enough of them. Every family in Briggs Creek was there, the Gruters and the Marshes and the Pierce family from the South Range and the 2 Holt brothers who ran cattle on the creek's west side, and Reverend Alderman and his wife and the schoolteacher, Miss Day, and 30 or 40 more, filling the hall with lamplight in the smell of wood smoke and bodies and food. Nora had cooked for 2 days. She had made 4 pies and 3 loaves of the good bread and a venison stew that had been on the stove since the morning, and she had carried all of it to the church hall in the supply wagon with May.
And she had arranged it on the table with the efficiency of a woman who has done this kind of thing many times and does not require direction. Several women from the congregation had spoken to her about the bread, which was a known quantity in Briggs Creek by now, and she had given out the method to 2 of them who asked. Because she was not a woman who hoarded useful knowledge, she sat at the far end of the long table, beside May, where the household help sat. Because she was the household help and she understood the structure of things in a small town and did not have any particular feeling about it one way or the other. The meal was good. The room was warm. Tommy was at the children's table along the side wall and had the prayer book under his arm, which was where it always was in public, a habit so established that no one in the household thought to remark on it anymore. Ellis sat at the main table with the older children, and he ate his supper with the serious focus of a boy who has decided that enjoying himself is permissible and is allowing himself to do it. Cal sat at the head of the family's portion of the table. He spoke when he was spoken to, which was often, because in a county where a man's operation was known and respected, other men had questions and observations that required his attention. He answered them plainly and without elaboration, which was how he answered everything. Once, across the length of the table, his eyes moved to where Nora sat. And she happened to be looking in that direction, and their eyes met for a moment that was neither long nor short and then moved on, the way eyes do in crowded rooms when the meeting is not for public consumption. Josephine sat to Cal's right. She had dressed in the dark blue silk that was her best, which made her look, as she intended it to, like the appropriate woman at the appropriate table. She talked with the neighboring wives with the ease of a woman who had been doing this kind of thing, Well, her entire life.
She talked about the boys and their progress in school and her dedication to maintaining the household in the way Clara had kept it. And several women said warm things about Clara, because Clara had been well loved. And Josephine received these with the gracious, practiced sorrow of a woman who has made grief into a thing she wears.
The meal ended. Reverend Alderman said a prayer of thanks. Someone produced a fiddle. And then Josephine stood. She did it in the way she did everything, with an easy, natural authority that made it seem like the most obvious next thing to happen. As if the room had been waiting for it, she raised her glass.
She said she wanted to say a few words about how grateful she was to be in Briggs Creek this autumn, to be near her late sister's family, to be part of a community that had so generously supported the Whitmore boys through their difficult years.
She said Clara's name.
She pressed her hand to her collarbone.
She talked about the house and how Clara had kept it, the standards, the particular quality of care that a woman brought to a home when she was truly its mistress, truly its heart.
The room was warm and attentive in the way of a room that has eaten well, and is disposed to feel what it is being pointed toward. And then Josephine's eyes moved, with a timing that was too precise to be accidental, to the far end of the table.
She said she was grateful, of course, for the help that had come to the W in the difficult years.
Help of all kinds. She smiled. She said that their cook had certainly made herself quite at home at the W table. Every inch of her. The laughter came.
It rolled from the head of the table backward through the hall in a wave.
Nora heard it from a distance that was not distance. She was sitting 12 feet from where Josephine was standing, and the laughter was directly around her, and she was inside it, the way you can be inside a thing and still removed from it by the specific quality of your own steadiness.
She did not look down.
She was aware of her hands in her lap.
She was aware of the heat in her face and the woman across from her who had turned toward the window.
She was aware of May, 3 seats down, who had gone very still. She looked at Tommy.
Tommy was in the third pew along the side wall,
and he was holding his mother's prayer book with both hands. And his face had done the thing she had never seen it do before.
It had collapsed, not into tears,
not outwardly, but into something quieter and more serious. The face of a child who has just understood something about the world that he did not want to understand.
Who has felt, for the first time, the specific cruelty of adults laughing at someone who does not deserve to be laughed at, and who does not know yet what to do with that knowledge in his 7-year-old body. He looked at her. He looked at her with the prayer book
pressed flat against his chest, and his small face open and broken. She looked back at him.
She did not look down. Cal Whitmore was at the head of the table.
And she made herself look at him, because she needed to know. And what she saw was not nothing. His face had gone very still, the particular stillness she had come to recognize as the thing that happened behind his expression when something had entered him and was being held until he understood what to do with it.
He was not laughing.
His eyes moved to Nora, and then to Josephine, and then to Nora again. And there was something in them that she recognized, because she had seen it once before, on the morning in October when he had heard what he had heard through the open kitchen window, and gone to the dining room door.
But he said nothing. Not yet. Not here.
In the hall. In front of the whole county. With Josephine's glass still raised and the laughter still finding its end.
She understood this. She was a practical woman.
She understood that there were things that could not be addressed in a church hall in front of 30 families,
and that addressing them there would do more damage than it repaired. She did not need him to stand up in that room.
She needed only what she saw in his face, which was that he had heard it, and that he had felt it, and that it was inside him now, in the place where the things that mattered to him were kept. It was enough, or it would have been enough, if she had been a different kind of woman, in a different kind of situation.
But she was Nora Beale, who had stood on the bank of the Musselshell River and watched the current take her husband, and had walked downstream for a quarter mile, and had come back, and had done the next thing, and the thing after that.
And she understood, standing in the lamplight of that church hall, with the laughter still fading around her, that there was a category of wound from which you did not recover by staying in the place where you received it.
Not because you were weak, because you were honest. She was going to leave. The decision was not dramatic. It arrived in her the way the serious decisions had always arrived,
not as a choice, but as a recognition of something that had already been decided by the facts of the situation. The way you recognize a mathematical truth when the numbers finally arrange themselves correctly. She was going to leave because staying would mean that this was the arrangement, permanently. That she was a punchline in the place where she worked and slept. And she had been poor, and she had been alone. And she had been looked at her whole life in the way that people looked at her. But she had never been a punchline. And she was not going to start now. She stayed through the fiddle music. She helped May clear the dishes. She said goodnight to the women who spoke to her, and she spoke to no one else. And she rode back to the Double W in the supply wagon with May. And May did not say anything. And Nora did not say anything. And the Montana night was enormous and cold around them, and the stars were out in their winter numbers. Indifferent to everything below them, which Nora found, tonight, not cold, but clarifying. In the kitchen she put the kettle on and sat at the work table and thought, with the practical efficiency of a woman who has made a decision and is now moving into the logistics of it. She would need to tell May. She would need to account for the kitchen through the end of the week, long enough for May to manage, or for someone to come from town. She had $11 and some change in the lining of her bag, plus the letter she had never used. She had the skillet, which was hers. She had the stage to Billings on Monday, which was 3 days. She would leave Sunday morning. She would be gone before the house woke. She put the kettle away without drinking the tea she had heated it for. She went to her room, which was the small room off the kitchen addition, and she began to move through it with the quiet efficiency of a woman who has packed up and moved before and knows how to do it without waking anyone, and without leaving a room looking abandoned, because the room was not hers, and it deserved to be left properly. Her dress from the supper she folded and packed. Her second apron. The almanac. The receipts she kept in the tin box on the shelf. Her own records. The cast-iron skillet wrapped in the good apron. In the bottom of the bag. Where it had traveled before and would travel again. She sat down at the small table in her room, where she had eaten her breakfast, on the mornings she did not eat in the kitchen. And she opened the top drawer and took out her pencil. Tommy's prayer book was in her room. He had left it there the week before, having decided without announcement that it lived in the kitchen now rather than upstairs, a decision he had made with the sovereign authority of a 7-year-old over his own most important possession. It was sitting on her window ledge where she had put it after their session that morning. She picked it up. She turned to the last page. There was still room on it. She had been careful with the margins through the whole book, writing small, making the definitions precise, because she had not wanted to crowd the prayers, and the result was that this last page, which was blank and had been blank since the book was new, had never been touched. She did not mean to write anything. She opened it to see what was left of it, to understand what she was leaving Tommy with and what she was not. The blank page looked back at her. She wrote. She wrote the way she always wrote when she was not trying to write for anyone, which was plainly and without decoration, because there was no one in the room, and so there was no reason to perform anything. She wrote, "I have been looked at my whole life. I did not expect to mind it anymore. I was wrong about that. I minded this one." She looked at what she had written. Then she wrote one more line beneath it. "You were the best of it, you and your book and your words. You were the best thing in a long time." She closed the book. She sat with it in her hands for a moment in her room, with the lamp low and the house quiet around her. Then she got up and carried it across the dark kitchen and up the back stairs, moving in the particular silence of a person who has spent months learning the sounds of a house, where the boards spoke and where they didn't. How to carry the lamp so the light didn't reach under the doors. She went to Tommy's room. He was asleep. He slept the way he always slept, which was completely and with his whole body, sprawled flat on his back, with his arms out. The way of a child who has never had reason to sleep defensively. In the low lamplight his face was smooth and young and utterly himself. And Nora stood in the doorway and looked at it for a moment, and did not let herself stand there longer than a moment, because there was a category of thing you could not allow yourself too long a look at, if you intended to do a practical thing immediately afterward. She set the prayer book on his pillow, beside his head. She went back to her room and finished packing. She set the bag by the door. She lay down on the bed without undressing. Because she needed to be up at 4, and she did not trust herself to sleep past it. And she lay in the dark with her hands folded on her chest, and looked at the ceiling, and was as honest as she knew how to be with herself, which was her only real standard for anything. She had minded this one. She had minded it because it was not simply humiliation, which she had survived before. She had minded it because it had happened in front of Tommy, because she had seen his face. Because there are things you can sustain in private that become unsustainable the moment a child who loves you is in the room to see them done to you. And you understand, suddenly and completely, what it will teach him about the world if you stay. She had minded it because of 5 o'clock in the morning and the coffee and the kitchen window going from black to gray while Cal Whitmore sat at the far end of the work table with both hands around his cup and said things he chose carefully because he understood what words were for. She had minded it because of October and the kitchen garden turned on the south side of the house, without ceremony or comment, because of the wheat and the turkey red and the 45 seconds behind the dining room door, because of the way Ellis had sat down on the floor of the barn beside her without being asked, and walked back to the house beside her in the frost. She had minded this one because she had not expected to care about any of it. And she had cared about all of it. And it turned out that caring, when you had decided not to, cost more than not caring had ever cost you. Because not caring was cheap and caring was expensive, and the bill came due in church halls, in front of 30 families, and a child with his mother's prayer book pressed against his chest. She was going to leave. She was going to leave because she was Nora Beale and she was practical, and she knew the difference between a wound you stayed to tend and a wound that required you to remove yourself from the place where it was being made. And she was not angry. She was clear. She closed her eyes. She was up at 4. She dressed in the dark. She had left the kitchen banked properly, because whoever came after her would need the stove. She put on her coat and her hat and she picked up her bag and she went through the kitchen without lighting the lamp, by memory and by the gray beginnings of pre-dawn coming through the east window. And she did not look at the work table or the stove or the shelf where Tommy's stool was pushed in. And she went out the back door. The Montana morning was not yet morning. It was the dark before the dark lifts. The particular hour when the cold is its most serious and the stars are their most definite, and the land around you is a deeper black against a black sky, and you move through it, trusting that the path is where you remember it. She walked to the road. She did not look back. She had been walking for 20 minutes. The town 2 hours ahead of her on foot, when she became aware of something she had not accounted for, which was that leaving was not the same as not minding. She had known she would leave. She had not known that the leaving would feel like this. Like walking away from a house that had, without her explicit permission, arranged itself around her in the shape of a home. She kept walking, one foot, then the other. At the double W, Tommy Whitmore woke at 5 o'clock, as he always did, and reached sideways for the prayer book that lived on his pillow, and his hand found it where she had left it, and he held it against his chest in the dark without opening it, the way he had held it for 2 years. And then he got up and put on his clothes and went downstairs to the kitchen. The stove was banked, the kitchen was cold and dark, and Nora was not there. Tommy stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the room. He was 7 years old. And there are things that 7-year-olds understand without being told. The way they understand the temperature of a room before they've registered that the fire is out. With the whole body before the mind catches up. He went back upstairs and knocked on his father's door. Cal opened it. He had not been deeply asleep. He had not been deeply asleep since November of 1881, which May could have told you, and which his own body had long since accepted as its condition. He looked at his son in the gray hall. "She's gone," Tommy said. Cal looked at him. "She's gone, Papa," Tommy said again, as if his father had not heard the first time. "Miss Beale, she's not in the kitchen." Cal stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he said, "Go put your boots on." He went to her room first. The door was open, which was how he knew, before he looked in,
The room was neat and empty, with the particular emptiness of a space that has been lived in carefully and departed from carefully. The kind of emptiness that respects the room it leaves behind. The bed was made. The shelf was clear. The small table had nothing on it. He stood in the doorway and looked at the empty room, and felt something move in his chest that he recognized. Because he had felt it before, that cold moving thing, for years ago in another room. He had stood in another doorway and looked at another emptiness. He had learned, in the years since, that emptiness was a room's way of telling you the exact dimensions of what was gone. He went to the kitchen. He put wood in the stove. He put the kettle on, because it was something to do with his hands. Tommy came downstairs in his coat and boots and stood in the kitchen with the prayer book against his chest, and watched his father with the focused, frightened attention of a child waiting to understand what the adults were going to do. Ellis came down the stairs. He took one look at the kitchen and one look at his father and said nothing. "She left her book," Tommy said. Cal looked at him. "She left it on my pillow." Tommy said, "But it's her book, she writes in it." "I left it in her room last week so she'd have it to write in." He looked at the prayer book in his hands and then held it out to his father. "She should have it, to read on the road." Cal took the book from Tommy's hands. He held it for a moment. Then he sat down at the far end of the work table, in the place where he always sat, with both hands around the book the way he usually held his coffee. And he looked at it. "Go eat something," he said to the boys. "May will be in directly." He waited until he heard them moving. Then he opened the book. He turned the pages slowly. He had been in this book before, years ago, when Clara had been the one who held it, and he knew the psalms and the prayers by the sight of them, the familiar arrangement of the words on the pages. But the book he was holding now was not the book he remembered. The book he was holding was different in a way that he felt before he understood. The margins. He went back to the beginning, and he read from the beginning. Slowly. The way he read everything that mattered. The handwriting was small and precise, with the compression of someone who was careful about space and careful about words. And it was everywhere. Every page that had a word worth stopping at. And some pages it was only a few words. And some pages it was a small paragraph. And besides some definitions, there were drawings. Small and plain and exact. A pair of folded hands. A tree in wind. A lamp with its circle of light. He read Tommy's name, written large on the inside front cover in block letters so a child could trace them. He read the word steadfast, and the definition, and the small tree beside it. And he thought about his son at the work table in the early morning, tracing the roots without touching the page. He read covenant. He read supplication. He read merciful. He turned pages. He read the book the way he read things he considered worth his time, which was completely and in order, and without skipping. He read it the way you read something when you understand, part way through, that you are reading something you will not be able to unread. That is rearranging something in you as you go and that you are not going to be able to put back the way it was. He reached the last page. He read what she had written. He read it once. Then he sat at the work table in the kitchen that smelled of the banked fire, and the cold morning, and 2 months of bread baked in this room by this woman. And he read it again. I have been looked at my whole life. I did not expect to mind it anymore. I was wrong about that. I minded this one. He sat with this for a long time. Then he read the second line. You were the best of it. You and your book and your words. You were the best thing in a long time. Cal Whitmore sat at the kitchen table and looked at what Nora Beale had written on the last page of his dead wife's prayer book. In the dark of the early morning, before she left, when she had not intended anyone to find it. And he felt something in his chest that he had not felt in 2 years. And another thing in his eyes that he had not felt in longer than that. He put both hands flat on the table. He said, to no one, to the empty kitchen, to the cold stove and the gray window, and the room that held her absence the way a room holds the shape of something that has been in it for a long time. I see you, Nora Beale. He sat for one more moment. Then he stood.
He went to the back door and took his hat and coat off the peg and put them on with the efficiency of a man who has decided where he is going and sees no reason to reconsider.
He went out. The road from the Double W to Briggs Creek was 6 miles of frozen ground and open sky. And in November, before full sunrise, it was the color of iron and the color of old bone and the color of nothing in particular, which was the color Montana made when it was not trying to be beautiful and was simply being true.
Cal rode it in 40 minutes. He was not a man who rode hard without reason.
He had learned, in 20 years of working this land, that horses and men both lasted longer when you did not spend them recklessly, and that most urgencies that felt absolute in the moment turned out, in the long accounting, to have had more time than you thought. He had built his whole operation on this principle. Steady. Considered. One thing done right before the next thing began. He rode hard. He had done a calculation that was simple and not simple. She had left before 4, which was when the kitchen cold had woken May, who had come downstairs to find the stove banked and the room empty, and had gone immediately to check the back road. She had seen nothing, which meant Nora had a start of at least an hour, probably more. The stage to Billings did not leave until 8:30. That was from the depot in town, which was 2 hours on foot from the ranch. She would be in town before he was, but she would be waiting. He rode into Briggs Creek at 6:30. With the sky beginning to separate into its layers, the deep black going to dark blue, going to the first gray of morning along the eastern edge. The town was not yet awake in any serious way. Smoke from a few chimneys. A light in the back of the general store. The stage depot was at the end of the main street, a long low building with a covered porch and a bench along the front where passengers waited. He saw her before she saw him. She was sitting on the bench with her bag between her feet and her coat buttoned to the collar, and her hands folded in her lap. And she was looking at the street in the way of a person who has been sitting for a while, and has made their peace with sitting. She was not crying. He had not expected her to be crying. She was simply sitting, with the particular self-contained stillness of a woman who had decided something and was waiting for the next thing with the patience she brought to everything. He pulled up in front of the depot, and she looked up. Their eyes met. He got down from the horse. He wrapped the reins around the porch post. He took off his hat. He stood in front of her on the depot porch in the early morning of the 16th of November, 1883, with the whole street empty around them, and the sky doing what it did at this hour over Montana, which was become more itself with every passing minute. And he said the only thing he could think of that was true, and that she deserved to hear, said plainly. "I read the book," he said. She looked at him. Her face did not change, but something happened behind it. A shift in the quality of her stillness. A change in what the stillness was containing. "That page was private," she said. "I know," he said. She looked at him for a long moment, then she looked at the street, which was still empty, and at the sky, which was going blue at its eastern edge. "You shouldn't have come," she said. Nora shred. It was the first time he had used her given name. He had not planned to. It came out of him the way the few true things he said came, without rehearsal, because he was not a man who rehearsed the things that mattered. She looked at him. "You have been seen in that house since the day you came into it," he said, "by me and by my boys and by May, who does not give her regard to people who have not earned it in full. You have been seen every morning at 5 o'clock and every night at supper, and every day in between. And what has been seen is a woman of more worth than this town, or my household has had the occasion to say clearly." He stopped. He was not a man given to speeches, and he could feel the edges of his own articulation, the places where he were running up against the limits of what he could find words for, and what he simply knew. "What was done to you last night was wrong. It was done in my house and on my watch, and I am sorry for it. I should have spoken in that hall and I did not, and that is mine to carry." She was quiet. "I am asking you to come back," he said. "Not as the cook." He paused. He had thought about how to say this on the road in, and he had not found a better way to say it than plainly. "I am asking you to consider a different arrangement, one that is yours by right if you want it, and that no one in that house or this county will have the standing to make a joke of." The sky was fully separating now into its morning layers.
The first direct light was touching the upper windows of the buildings across the street.
Nora looked at him for a long time. She looked at him the way she looked at things she was deciding about, which was with the whole of her attention, steadily, without letting the looking be rushed. "There are things to be settled first," she said.
"Yes," he said. "In the house," she said. "Before I will discuss anything else. There are things that need to be settled in that house directly, and I need to be present when they are." He looked at her. "I know about the letter to Gerald Foss," she said. Something moved in his face that she had not seen before. It was not anger, exactly.
It was the specific expression of a man who has just understood the full dimensions of a situation he had only understood partially until this moment, and who is recalibrating accordingly. "Tell me," he said.
She told him. She told him plainly and without embellishment, the way she told everything. The letter and its 3 paragraphs and Mr.
Foss and the territorial law and what Josephine had intended to do with it.
She watched him hear it. Watched the recalibration complete itself in his face. Watched him become very still in the way she had learned meant that something had entered him and taken its final position.
He was quiet for a moment. Then he said,
"Come home." She picked up her bag. They rode back to the W in the wagon he had brought, having tied the horse behind. And the Montana morning opened around them as they went, the sky going from gray to blue to the particular hard clean blue of a November day that intends to be cold and beautiful and entirely itself.
They did not talk much.
There was not much that needed saying yet, and they were both practical people who understood the difference between the talk that preceded the doing and the talk that came after. And this was the middle part, where you simply went. May was at the kitchen door when they came into the yard.
She looked at Nora and then at Cal, and she said nothing at all, which was May's version of everything she needed to say.
The boys were at the kitchen table. Tommy came off his stool at a speed that suggested he had not fully sat down on it, and he crossed the kitchen and took hold of Nora's coat sleeve with both hands, not hugging her, just holding the sleeve, the way children hold the things they are afraid of losing before they are sure they have them back.
She put her hand over his. Ellis was standing at the far end of the table. He looked at her with his mother's eyes.
And then he looked at his father. And then he looked back at Nora with an expression that she understood was Ellis making a decision, the kind of decision he made rarely and completely.
"You came back,"
he said. "I did," she said. He nodded once, and turned back to his breakfast. "And that was Ellis," Cal said. "Boys, finish eating. Then go out to May." He looked at May. May took the boys' plates and steered them toward the back door with the efficiency of a woman who has managed households and understood when required that her most useful function was to be elsewhere. Cal went to the foot of the stairs. "Josephine," he said. His voice was level and carried with a completeness that left no question of whether it had been heard.
A pause.
Then footsteps above. Then Josephine came down the stairs in her morning dress, her hair not yet pinned, an expression arranged on her face that was attempting to look unsurprised and not quite managing it.
She saw Nora. She stopped on the 3rd step from the bottom. "I see you've returned,"
she said. Her voice was entirely smooth. This was what Josephine did under pressure. Became smoother, the way a stone becomes smooth from the water running over it. The resistance going underground. "Come into the front room," Cal said. It was not a request. Josephine came off the stairs and went into the front room with the composure of a woman who has decided that composure is the last remaining instrument available to her and intends to play it to the end.
Cal followed her. Nora followed Cal.
May came in from the kitchen with her hands folded.
And behind May came Ellis. And behind Ellis came Tommy, still in his coat, with the prayer book against his chest. Nobody had told them to come.
They came because the house was small and they were its people. And they understood without being told that what was happening in the front room was something the whole house needed to be present for. Josephine stood in the center of the front room and looked at the people filing in around her, and something shifted very slightly in her face. The first fracture in the composure, the smallest beginning of a rearrangement she had not planned.
Cal did not sit. He stood in the front room with the prayer book in his hand, which Nora understood he had carried from the kitchen. And he looked at Josephine with the expression of a man who has done his recalibrating and arrived at a position he will not be moved from.
He said, "I'm going to read you something." Josephine said, "Calvin." Whatever Nora has told you. Josephine, he said, not loudly. She stopped.
He opened the book to the last page. He read what was there in the plain, careful voice of a man who reads aloud the way he speaks, without performance and without any interest in effect, because the words were enough. He read, "I have been looked at my whole life. I did not expect to mind it anymore.
I was wrong about that. I minded this one."
He read the second line. The front room was quiet. Josephine's composure was very nearly intact. There was one thing it could not smooth over, which was the color that had come into her face. Not shame, not quite, but the thing that precedes shame in a person who is still deciding whether to feel it.
"That is very moving," she said, "but I don't see what it—" "I know about the letter to Gerald Foss," Cal said. The room went a different kind of quiet.
Josephine looked at him, then her eyes moved to May. And May looked back at her with the steady, unapologetic regard of a woman who has served this house for 9 years and is entirely clear about whose house it is. "I wrote that letter out of concern for the boys,"
Josephine said. "You have an unmarried woman living in this house with 2 young children and no proper oversight, and I thought it was my responsibility as their aunt to—" "You wrote that letter," Cal said, "because you came here in July with a particular idea of how things stood in this house, and you found them standing differently than you expected. And when what you tried at the supper table last night didn't accomplish what you intended, you were going to use my boys as the instrument of it."
"That's what that letter was."
Josephine said nothing. "I am going to say this once," Cal said. "The arrangement in this house is changing. Nora Beale is not the cook.
She is not the help. She is not a subject for your concern, or your letters, or your supper toasts." He paused.
"I would like you to be gone from this house by Wednesday. I'll arrange your passage back to Helena, and I'll pay for it, because whatever else is true, you are Clara's sister, and I will not put you on the road without the means to travel decently."
"But you will be on the Wednesday stage." Josephine looked at him for a long moment. She looked at him with all the composure she had left, which was considerable.
And then she looked at Nora, and there was something in that look that was very nearly human,
which was the look of a woman who has played a hand completely, and lost it completely, and knows it, and does not yet know who she will be now that the hand is gone. She did not say she was sorry. Nora did not expect her to. She said, "Clara would not have approved of this." Cal said,
"Clara would have approved of exactly this. You know that as well as I do, Josephine.
You know what Clara thought of people who were exactly what they said they were."
Josephine's face did the last thing it did before she left the room, which was to become entirely still for one moment.
And in that stillness, Nora saw something she had not expected to see.
Which was the brief, unguarded face of a woman who was also grieving,
who had also loved Clara and lost her,
and had come here out of something real underneath the other things, and whose real grief had curdled, somewhere along the way, into something she was not going to recover from easily.
Then she left the room.
Her footsteps went up the stairs. Her bedroom door closed. The front room let out its breath. Tommy was still holding the prayer book against his chest. He had been standing beside May through all of it. And he had not moved. And his face had done something remarkable throughout, which was to become, with each passing minute, more settled. The look of a child watching a situation become what it should be, and feeling his own body adjust to that correctness.
He crossed the room. He held the prayer book out to Nora with both hands. "The way you offer something you understand is valuable.
You can keep writing in it," he said. "There's still room." Nora looked at the book in his hands. She looked at Tommy. She took the book.
She put it in her apron pocket, where her pencil lived, and she put her hand on Tommy's head for a moment. One brief and certain gesture. And he leaned into it without thinking. The way children lean into the things they trust. Josephine left on Wednesday. Cal arranged the passage. He carried her trunks to the wagon himself, which was the thing he could do, and he did it without resentment,
because he was not a man who carried resentment where ordinary decency would serve. She did not say goodbye to the boys. Nora had thought she might, at the last, find something real to say to them, and she did not. And this was the last and truest thing Josephine did. The honest declaration of a woman who had never, in all her weeks at the W,
understood that the boys were the point. The house was infrastructure. She was gone by 9. May made griddle cakes. It was the Friday after that Ellis found Nora in the kitchen at the start of the morning. Before Tommy was down, before Cal had come in from the barn, she was at the stove, as she always was. And he came in from the back door in his coat, and stood for a moment in the way he stood when he was delivering something he had been carrying for a while. "Miss Beale," he said. "Ellis," she said. "The calf made it," he said. "The one from November, I checked on it this morning, it's running." She turned from the stove and looked at him. This boy with his mother's eyes and his father's stillness, and his own particular kind of courage, which was the courage of a person who shows up honestly in difficult situations and stays. "Is it?" she said. "It's strong," he said. He looked at his boots for a moment. "Then back up. I thought you'd want to know. I'm glad you told me," she said. He nodded. He went to the table and sat down for breakfast. And that was all he said. And it was enough, and they both understood that it was enough. The proposal was on a Sunday evening in the first week of December, which was 3 weeks after Josephine had left, and which was, though neither of them marked the coincidence aloud, the same month in which Daniel Marsh had married Catherine Howell, though Nora did not know that story and neither did Cal. They were on the back porch. This had become their evening version of the 5 o'clock mornings, the boys inside and May cleaning up and the two of them on the porch in their coats, with the Montana evening enormous and cold around them, and the stars beginning their winter count overhead. Cal had not been building to this, or he had been building to it without knowing he was building to it, which was how he built most things. In the particular way of a man who knows what he is building toward and allows the practical steps to arrange themselves. He said, "I've been thinking about the spring." She said, "The kitchen garden will need starting in March." He said, "I've been thinking about more than the kitchen garden." She looked at the mountains, which were dark shapes against a sky going from blue to black. He said, "I am not a man who makes speeches." "I think you know that." "I do." She said, "I am a man who keeps his word." He said, "And I would like, if you are willing, to give you mine." She was quiet for a moment. The night was around them, cold and clear and honest, the way Montana nights were honest, which was without softening anything, just showing you what was there. "I am willing," she said. He looked at her. The expression on his face was the one she had been trying to name since August. Since the first 5 o'clock morning when he had sat at the far end of the work table with both hands around his coffee and looked at the window going from black to gray. She thought she had it now. It was the expression of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a long time, and has set it down. Not because the weight is gone, but because there is someone beside him who knows the weight is there, and has chosen to stand next to it anyway. It was not the absence of grief. It was something built alongside grief. Something that did not require the grief to be over. She thought it was the bravest expression she had ever seen on a human face. In the kitchen, behind the closed door, something dropped and Tommy said a word that was not appropriate, and Ellis told him so. And then there was the sound of both of them laughing, a sound that ran the length of the house, and came through the door and out onto the porch, and went up into the Montana night. And Cal Whitmore tilted his head toward it and listened. He laughed. It came out of him, unpracticed and complete. A real laugh. The laugh of a man who has forgotten, for a moment, that he is carrying what he is carrying. Nora watched it happen, and felt something shift in the whole house around her. The way you feel a structure settle into its true shape, the sound of everything finding its level. She laughed too. They were married on the 3rd of December. In the front room of the W, by the county judge, who drove out from Briggs Creek in his good coat, and who said the words he always said at these occasions, with the straightforward efficiency of a man who understood that the ceremony was not the point, and that the people before him knew this as well as he did. May stood as witness. She wore her good dress, which was dark green wool, and she held her hands folded in front of her, and watched the proceedings with the expression of a woman who has waited 4 years to see something right happen in this house, and is allowing herself to feel the rightness of it without any performance of the feeling. Ellis stood at his father's left and was entirely serious.
in the way of a 12-year-old boy who understands that he is present at something that matters, and who wishes to be adequate to it. And he was. Tommy stood at Nora's right and held the prayer book against his chest with one hand and her hand with the other. And his face was the most uncomplicated happy face she had ever seen,
which was the face of a child whose world has arranged itself the way he needed it to arrange itself, and who has not yet learned to be suspicious of
good things. The judge said the words. They said the words back. Cal put a ring on her finger. He had ridden into Briggs Creek the week before and come home without explaining where he had been. And what he had brought back was this: a simple silver band with a small bunchgrass engraving running around it. Because bunchgrass was what this land was. And what this land was what they were. She looked at it on her hand.
Then Tommy held the prayer book up to her, open to the last page. And she understood without being told that this was the moment for it.
She took her pencil from her apron pocket, which was where it always was, and she bent over the book in Tommy's hands, and in the space below what she had written on the night she left, below the 2 lines she had not meant anyone to find, she wrote 3 words. Then she straightened up. The judge shook Cal's hand. May went to the kitchen and came back with the cake she had been making since the previous evening. Tommy tugged on Nora's hand, and she bent down, and he whispered something in her ear that made her close her eyes for a moment, and then open them and look at the front room and all the people in it. Later that evening, after supper, after May had gone home and the boys were in bed, and the house was the house at night, which was the best version of it, quiet and warm and smelling of bread and the banked fire and the particular piece of a place that is full of the people it is supposed to be full of. Cal came to the kitchen where Nora was putting up the last of the dishes, and he held out the prayer book. She had left it on the table when she went to the kitchen. He had picked it up. What does it say? He said. What you wrote tonight. She looked at the book and then at him. Read it, she said. He opened it to the last page. He read what had been there since November. Then he read the 3 words she had added tonight, in her small, precise handwriting, beneath everything else. I was wrong. Stay. He stood in the kitchen doorway with the book in his hands, and read those 3 words that were the whole arc of it, the whole story, from the river to this room. And his face did the thing she had been watching it try to do since August, which was to let something fully in. He looked up at her. She was at the kitchen window, the one that faced east, the one she had noted on her first day as the window that caught the morning light. Outside it was full dark, and the glass showed her own reflection and his behind her, the 2 of them in the lamplight of the kitchen of the W. She was thinking about the harvest supper, about the church doorway and the November sky behind her and the laughter rolling backward through the hall and Tommy's face in the 3rd pew. She had stood in that doorway and not looked down. And the sky had been enormous and cold and entirely indifferent to everything that was happening beneath it. She was thinking that she would stand in that doorway again. Not tonight, but she would. Because Briggs Creek was a small town and small towns did not forget, and she would stand in that doorway every Sunday for as long as she lived here. And what would be different was not the doorway and not the sky and not the congregation inside. What would be different was Tommy's hand in hers, and Cal's hand at the small of her back, and what she would feel, standing there in that doorway with the Montana sky enormous behind her and the weight of a winter's worth of mornings and bread and words and one small prayer book full of margins. Was not the absence of what had been done to her. The wound would always be somewhere in her. The way Roy was somewhere in her, and the Musselshell was somewhere in her, and the $40 and the skillet and 2 years in Billings. She was not a woman who pretended that things had not happened. She was a woman who understood the difference between the wound and the door. She thought same doorway, same sky, same woman. Finally arrived. Cal closed the prayer book. He crossed the kitchen and set it on the shelf above the stove, in the place where the almanac lived, where it could be reached easily by a woman who cooked here and by a boy who came at 5 in the morning with words he was saving. He put his hand on her shoulder. Outside, the Montana night was what it always was, which was entirely itself. The stars were their winter number. The grass was silver with cold. The mountains in the far dark were the shape they had always been. And the kitchen was warm.
and the lamp held its circle of gold. And Nora Beale, who had been looked at her whole life, stood at the east window of the double W and looked out at the dark and felt, for the first time in a long time, and then for the rest of her life, completely seen.